The evening sun cast long shadows across Millbrook's quiet residential streets, painting the neighborhood in hues of amber and gold. Children's laughter echoed from backyards where families gathered for dinner, their voices carrying on the warm September breeze. It was the kind of peaceful suburban setting where parents felt safe letting their children play until the streetlights flickered on, where neighbors knew each other by name, and where tragedy seemed as distant as the mountains that bordered their small Oregon town. Yet beneath this tranquil surface, one father's world had been shattered 8 years ago, leaving behind questions that haunted every sunset and shadows that held memories too painful to bear. Michael Harrison stood at his living room window, watching the same street where his 7-year-old son Tommy had vanished without a trace. The police had searched every house, every basement, every shed within a 10-mile radius. Search parties had combed through forests, dragged ponds, and followed every lead that emerged from the community's desperate efforts to bring Tommy home. But as weeks turned to months and months became years, the case grew cold. Filing cabinets in the sheriff's office holding the only evidence of a little boy who had simply disappeared while playing in his own backyard. Tonight, something felt different. Perhaps it was the way the light fell across the old oak tree in his yard, or maybe it was the letter he'd received that morning from a construction company. But Michael felt a stirring in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years. A whisper of possibility that made his hands tremble as he gripped the windowsill. Before we dive deeper into this story, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to the channel. That way you'll always stay updated with our upcoming videos and continue discovering more fascinating stories. Now, let's begin. The morning of September 15th, 2016, had started like any other in the Harrison household. Michael had kissed his wife Sarah goodbye as she left for her teaching job at the elementary school. Her coffee mug still warm in the sink, her reminder about Tommy's soccer practice that evening, written in neat handwriting on the refrigerator whiteboard. Tommy, their spirited 7-year-old with unruly brown hair and eyes that sparkled with mischief, had bounded down the stairs wearing his favorite superhero pajamas, already planning his day of adventure. "Dad, can I build a fort in the backyard today?" Tommy had asked, syrup dripping from his fork as he attacked his pancakes with the enthusiasm only a child could muster. His small feet swung beneath the kitchen table, never quite still, always ready for the next great expedition. Michael remembered every detail of that conversation with crystalline clarity. The way Tommy's face lit up when he said yes, the excited squeal that followed, the sticky hug he received before Tommy darted upstairs to change into his play clothes. These moments, once ordinary and taken for granted, had become precious artifacts in Michael's memory, polished smooth by years of careful preservation. The backyard of their 2-story colonial home stretched back nearly an acre, bordered by a wooden fence that Michael had built himself when they first moved in. Ancient oak trees provided shade and perfect climbing opportunities, while Sarah's flower beds added splashes of color along the perimeter. It was a child's paradise, complete with a swing set, sandbox, and plenty of space for imagination to run wild. Tommy had spent the morning gathering supplies for his fort: old blankets from the linen closet, lawn chairs to serve as structural supports, and his collection of action figures to defend the fortress once construction was complete. Michael had watched from the kitchen window as he worked on his laptop, stealing glances at his son's determined efforts to create the perfect hideaway beneath the largest oak tree. The last time Michael saw Tommy alive, the boy was dragging a blue tarp across the grass, his tongue poking out in concentration as he wrestled with the unwieldy material. The sun was high overhead, casting dappled shadows through the leaves, and Tommy's laughter carried on the gentle breeze as he called out to his father about his architectural progress. "Dad, come see, it's almost ready," Tommy had shouted, his voice bright with pride and excitement. 5 more minutes, buddy, Michael had called back, his attention divided between a work email and his son's enthusiasm. Let me finish this report, and I'll come check out your masterpiece. Those 5 minutes stretched into 15, then 30. When Michael finally closed his laptop and walked to the back door, ready to admire Tommy's creation, he found only silence. The blue tarp lay abandoned on the ground, lawn chairs scattered in a way that suggested hasty departure, rather than careful deconstruction. The action figures remained lined up where Tommy had positioned them, tiny plastic sentinels guarding a fort that would never be completed. "Tommy?" Michael had called, his voice carrying across the yard. "Tommy, where are you?" The silence that answered was different from the comfortable quiet of a child absorbed in play. This silence had weight, a presence that pressed against Michael's chest and sent the first tendrils of fear snaking through his veins. He walked the perimeter of the yard, calling his son's name with increasing urgency, checking behind every tree, under every bush, inside the garden shed where Tommy sometimes liked to hide. The gate in the back fence hung open, its latch clearly visible but somehow wrong, as if it had been disturbed by hands other than Tommy's small ones. Michael's neighborhood was safe, the kind of place where children rode their bikes until dark and neighbors looked out for each other's kids. But as he stood staring at that open gate, a terrible understanding began to dawn. His 7-year-old son was gone, vanished as completely as if the earth had opened up and swallowed him whole. The fort remained unfinished, a testament to interrupted childhood and the cruel randomness of fate. Within hours, their quiet street would be filled with police cars, search teams, and the kind of chaos that accompanies every parent's worst nightmare. But in that first moment of realization, there was only silence and the blue tarp fluttering in the breeze, as if trying to tell a story that no one would ever fully understand. The Harrison house transformed overnight from a home into the nerve center of a massive search operation. Police officers tramped through rooms that had once echoed with Tommy's laughter, their radios crackling with updates and coordinates. Detective Ray Coleman, a seasoned investigator with kind eyes and graying temples, set up his makeshift headquarters at the dining room table, where Tommy had eaten his last breakfast, spreading maps and witness statements across the polished wood surface. Sarah had rushed home from school, her face pale with terror, still wearing the colorful cardigan she'd chosen that morning when the world made sense. She clutched Tommy's favorite stuffed bear, Mr. Buttons, against her chest, like a lifeline, her teacher's composure cracking under the weight of every parent's most primal fear. The house filled with neighbors, friends, and family members, all desperate to help, their hushed conversations creating a constant background hum of anxiety and hope. "Tell me again about the morning," Detective Coleman said gently, his pen poised over a fresh notepad. His voice carried the practiced calm of someone who had walked other families through this nightmare, but his eyes betrayed the urgency that drove every missing child case. Time was everything, and they all knew it. Michael recounted the morning's events with mechanical precision, each detail etched into his memory with painful clarity. The pancakes, the fort building plans, the blue tarp, the last glimpse of his son through the kitchen window. With each retelling, the story became both more real and more surreal, as if he were describing scenes from someone else's life. "The gate in the back fence," Detective Coleman noted. "You said it was open when you found it?" "Yes, but Tommy knows he's not supposed to go beyond our yard without permission," Sarah interjected, her voice cracking with the effort to maintain control. "He's a good boy, he follows the rules." The detective nodded sympathetically, but they all understood that 7-year-old boys, even good ones, sometimes forgot rules in the face of adventure or curiosity. The woods behind their property stretched for miles, connecting to hiking trails, camping areas, and eventually the Cascade National Forest. If Tommy had wandered into that vast wilderness, finding him would become exponentially more difficult with each passing hour. By nightfall, over 200 volunteers had assembled in the parking lot of Millbrook Elementary School. The scene resembled a military operation, with search teams organized by sectors, radio communications coordinated by the County Sheriff's Department, and helicopters circling overhead with powerful searchlights that swept across the darkening landscape. Parents clutched their own children a little tighter as they joined the search, understanding with crystal clarity that it could be any of them standing in the Harrisons' shoes. Michael found himself assigned to Team 7, searching the wooded area directly behind their home. Armed with flashlights, whistles, and grim determination, the volunteers spread out in a careful grid pattern, calling Tommy's name into the darkness. Every rustling bush, every snapped twig, every shadow that might be a small boy brought a surge of adrenaline, followed by crushing disappointment. "Tommy! Tommy Harrison!" The calls echoed through the trees, creating a haunting chorus that seemed to mock their efforts. Michael's voice grew hoarse from shouting, but he couldn't stop. Somewhere in this darkness, his son might be scared, hurt, or worse. The thought of Tommy alone in the woods, perhaps injured and unable to answer their calls, drove Michael forward, even as branches tore at his clothes and exhaustion weighted his limbs. The search continued through the night and resumed at dawn, expanding outward in concentric circles that eventually encompassed neighboring towns. Police dogs followed scent trails that led nowhere, their handlers shaking their heads in frustration as the trails simply vanished without explanation. Door-to-door canvassing revealed nothing suspicious, no strangers in the neighborhood, no unusual vehicles or activities reported in the days leading up to Tommy's disappearance. On the third day, a child's sneaker was found near Miller's Creek, about 5 miles from the Harrison home. Sarah collapsed when Detective Coleman showed her the small blue shoe, recognizing it immediately as one of the pair she'd bought Tommy for the start of the school year. The discovery shifted the search focus to the creek and its surrounding wetlands, teams of divers probing the murky water, while cadaver dogs worked the banks. But the creek yielded no other evidence. The shoe sat alone in an evidence bag, a single clue that raised more questions than it answered. How had it traveled so far from Tommy's backyard? Had he walked that distance on his own, or had someone taken him there? The absence of the matching shoe only deepened the mystery, leaving investigators to wonder if they were dealing with an accident, an abduction, or something else entirely. As days became weeks, the massive search operation gradually wound down. Volunteers returned to their normal lives, though many continued to check wooded areas during their daily routines, unable to shake the image of a little boy lost somewhere in the wilderness. The police maintained their investigation, following up on tips that came in from across the state. But Detective Coleman's visits became less frequent, his updates more routine than urgent. The terrible truth began to settle over the Harrison household, like dust on abandoned furniture. Tommy might never be found. In the space where certainty had once lived, a void opened up that would define the next 8 years of their lives, filled with unanswered questions and the devastating arithmetic of hope divided by time. The house that had once pulsed with the energy of a young family fell into a strange, suspended quiet. Tommy's room remained exactly as he had left it that September morning. Superhero posters on the walls, Legos scattered across the carpet from his latest construction project, his bed still unmade from where he'd jumped up eagerly to start his day. Sarah changed the sheets weekly and dusted his toys, maintaining the space as if her son might walk through the door at any moment, ready to continue whatever game he'd been playing when the world stopped. Michael threw himself into the search, with the obsession of a man trying to solve an impossible equation. He converted the garage into a command center, covering the walls with maps marked with colored pins, representing every location searched, every tip investigated, every lead that had faded into nothing. File cabinets filled with police reports, witness statements, and correspondence with other families of missing children created a paper mountain of hope and heartbreak. Detective Coleman continued to check in regularly, though both men understood that active investigation had given way to the waiting game that defined most cold cases. New leads became increasingly rare, and when they did surface, they invariably led to dead ends that left Michael feeling as if he were chasing ghosts through a maze with no exit. The National Center for Missing Children has Tommy's information in their database, Coleman explained during one of his visits 6 months after the disappearance. His photo gets updated with age progression software every year. If he's out there, someone will recognize him. The phrase "if he's out there" hung in the air like a physical presence, carrying implications that neither man wanted to voice. Statistics weren't kind to missing children cases, particularly when months had passed without solid leads. Michael knew the numbers. Detective Coleman had been honest about the odds from the beginning, but hope was a stubborn thing that refused to bow to logic or probability. Sarah's grief took a different path. Where Michael fought against the unknown with research and relentless activity, she began to withdraw into herself, her natural warmth cooling into something fragile and distant. She took a leave of absence from teaching, unable to face classrooms full of 7-year-olds who reminded her of what she'd lost. The flower beds she'd once tended with such care grew wild, as if nature itself was reclaiming space that joy had abandoned. Their marriage, once strong enough to weather normal storms, began to buckle under the weight of shared trauma. Conversations became careful negotiations around the obvious absence in their lives. Michael's determination to keep searching felt like accusation to Sarah, as if his refusal to consider the worst meant she was giving up too easily. Her need for some kind of closure, even painful closure, struck Michael as betrayal of their son's memory. "Maybe we should consider moving," Sarah suggested one evening as they sat at the dinner table, 2 plates where there should have been 3, silence filling the space where Tommy's chatter should have been. "This house, this neighborhood, everything here reminds us of what we've lost." Michael's response came swift and sharp. "This is where he knows to find us. If Tommy comes home, he'll come here." The conversation ended there, as so many did, with neither of them willing to voice the deeper questions that poisoned their sleep. How long do you wait for someone who might never return? How do you rebuild a life around an absence? When does hope become a prison that keeps you from moving forward? The 2nd anniversary of Tommy's disappearance brought a renewed media push, with Detective Coleman coordinating television appearances and newspaper features designed to keep the case in the public eye. Michael stood in front of news cameras, holding a recent school photo of Tommy, and made the same plea he'd made dozens of times before. Someone out there knows something. Tommy is still our little boy, and we're never going to stop looking for him. But privately, even Michael could feel the case growing cold around them, like water freezing slowly from the edges inward. Tips became fewer and less credible. The volunteers who had once filled their living room drifted away to deal with their own families, their own problems, their own lives that hadn't been frozen in time by tragedy. The world moved forward, while the Harrisons remained trapped in an eternal September 15th, waiting for resolution that seemed increasingly unlikely to come. By the 3rd year, Sarah had quietly begun seeing a grief counselor, though she never spoke to Michael about their sessions. She started substitute teaching again, taking assignments in districts far enough away that she wouldn't encounter former students or colleagues who knew their story. The careful structure she built around her days was designed to minimize reminders, to create small spaces where she could exist without the constant ache of loss. Michael's approach remained unchanged. Every Saturday morning found him in the woods, following new trails or revisiting old ones, armed with recent photos of Tommy and questions that had long since stopped yielding answers. He knew these woods better than the rangers now, could navigate by memory to every location where evidence had been found or reported. The blue sneaker had been the last real clue, but Michael continued his solitary pilgrimages as if devotion alone might unlock the mystery. The marriage survived, though it carried scars that would never fully heal. They learned to love each other around the empty space Tommy had left behind, to find intimacy despite the grief that lived between them like a permanent houseguest. Some days were better than others, moments when they could laugh together or make plans that extended beyond the next search effort. But the shadow never lifted completely, and they both understood that they were different people than they'd been before their son vanished. Parents without their child, a family with a missing piece that couldn't be replaced or forgotten. 8 years. 8 years of anniversaries marked by candlelight vigils and media interviews. 8 years of Tommy's room preserved like a shrine to interrupted childhood. 8 years of hoping for a phone call that never came, of watching other families' tragedies play out on the news, and feeling the familiar stab of recognition mixed with gratitude that at least their nightmare wasn't alone. But on this particular morning, as Michael stood at his living room window watching the street where his son had once played, something was different. The letter in his hand bore the letterhead of Millbrook Construction Company, and its contents would soon shatter the careful equilibrium they'd built around their loss, replacing years of questions with answers more shocking than they could have ever imagined. The envelope had arrived with Tuesday's mail, mixed among utility bills and grocery store circulars like any ordinary piece of correspondence. Michael almost discarded it without opening, assuming it was another contractor's solicitation for home improvement services. But something about the formal letterhead of Millbrook Construction Company caught his attention. Perhaps it was the logo's similarity to the town seal, or maybe just the way the morning light struck the embossed letters. Inside, the letter was brief and businesslike, signed by a foreman named Dave Patterson, whose neat handwriting suggested careful consideration of every word. The company had purchased the old Hillcrest property, 3 miles from the Harrison home, with plans to develop it into a residential subdivision. Before beginning construction, they needed to demolish several outbuildings that had been abandoned for decades, including a root cellar that appeared on historical surveys but had been forgotten by most long-time residents. "We're required to notify neighbors about the demolition schedule," the letter explained, "and given the proximity to your property, we wanted to ensure you were aware of our timeline. Excavation of the root cellar is planned for this Friday, weather permitting. Please contact our office if you have any questions or concerns about the project." Most homeowners would have filed the letter away without a second thought, perhaps making a mental note to expect some construction noise. But Michael wasn't most homeowners. 8 years of investigating every possibility, of following every lead no matter how remote, had trained him to see connections where others saw coincidence. The Hillcrest property bordered the woods where Tommy had vanished, and a root cellar was exactly the kind of hidden space that search teams might have overlooked. He found himself standing at the kitchen counter, reading the letter for the 4th time, his pulse quickening with each repetition. Sarah, preparing for another day of substitute teaching, noticed his stillness from across the room. "What is it?" she asked, recognizing the particular quality of attention that had become familiar over the years whenever something related to Tommy's case crossed their path. Her voice carried a mixture of concern and the weary skepticism that came from too many false leads and shattered hopes. Michael handed her the letter without speaking, watching her face as she read. He could see the exact moment when she made the same connection he had, her eyes widening slightly, before she schooled her expression back to careful neutrality. "Michael," she said softly, setting the letter down as if it might burn her fingers. "You can't seriously be thinking—" "I have to go there," he said, the words coming out more forcefully than he'd intended. "Before they demolish it, I need to see this root cellar. Sarah, what if we missed something? What if Tommy—" He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the possibility that had been growing in his mind like a tumor. The idea that his son might have been so close all these years, hidden in a place they'd never thought to look, was almost too painful to consider. But it was also impossible to ignore. Sarah's reaction was immediate and sharp. "No. Michael, no. We've been down this road too many times. Every tip, every possibility, every maybe that's torn our hearts out for 8 years. I can't do it again." Her voice broke on the last words, 8 years of accumulated grief and disappointment finally spilling over. She'd learned to protect herself from hope, the same way people learn to protect themselves from physical pain, through careful avoidance and emotional armor that had taken years to construct. "This is different," Michael insisted, though part of him recognized the desperation in his own voice. "A root cellar, Sarah. Think about it. Underground, hidden. Exactly the kind of place a scared 7-year-old might have gone to hide, or where someone might have—" "Stop!" Sarah's command was quiet, but absolute. "Just stop. I know what you're thinking, and I can't live through another false hope, followed by another crushing disappointment. I won't survive it, Michael. I've barely survived everything else." They stood on opposite sides of the kitchen counter, the letter lying between them like a bridge neither wanted to cross. 8 years of shared grief had taught them different lessons about survival. Michael had learned that stopping meant surrendering, that the only way to honor Tommy's memory was through relentless searching. Sarah had learned that hope without resolution was a form of torture, that healing required accepting the possibility that some questions would never be answered. "What if I go alone?" Michael asked, though he already knew her response would be. "Then you go alone," Sarah said, turning away to gather her school supplies. "But I won't be part of it anymore. I can't keep living in the past, Michael. I can't keep waiting for Tommy to walk through that door, and I can't keep watching you tear yourself apart chasing ghosts." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with 8 years of unspoken resentment and divergent paths through grief. They'd stayed together through the worst tragedy imaginable, but they'd never really agreed on how to survive it. Now, facing another potential revelation or heartbreak, the differences in their coping mechanisms had hardened into seemingly irreconcilable positions. Michael watched his wife leave for work, her footsteps echoing in the hallway that had once been filled with the sounds of a complete family. Then he picked up the phone and dialed the number printed on Millbrook Construction Company's letterhead. "Dave Patterson speaking." "This is Michael Harrison," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his chest. "I received your letter about the Hillcrest demolition. I need to ask you about the root cellar you mentioned." There was a pause on the other end, long enough for Michael to wonder if the connection had been lost. Then Patterson's voice came back, more careful now. "You're the father of the boy who went missing, aren't you? I remember when it happened. Terrible thing." "Yes," Michael said simply. "I know this might sound strange, but I need to see that root cellar before you demolish it. I need to look inside." Another pause, longer this time. Michael could hear machinery in the background, the sounds of an active construction site where decisions were made based on schedules and budgets rather than the desperate hopes of grieving parents. "I understand," Patterson said finally. "I've got kids of my own. Tell you what, we were planning to start Friday, but I can hold off until Monday if you want to take a look. Just, Mr. Harrison, you should know that place has been sealed up for probably 20 years. If there was anything to find, the state investigators would have found it back when your boy disappeared." "Maybe," Michael said, though they both knew the search had focused on the woods and waterways, not abandoned buildings miles away. "But I have to see for myself." "Thursday afternoon work for you? Say around 3 o'clock?" Michael agreed to the time, hung up the phone and stood alone in his kitchen, wondering if he was about to take the first step toward finally finding his son, or toward the most devastating disappointment of a life already defined by loss. Outside, the September morning looked exactly like the one 8 years ago, when Tommy had asked to build a fort in the backyard, when the future had seemed as predictable as sunrise, and fathers believed they could protect their children simply by watching from kitchen windows. But Thursday afternoon was only 2 days away, and with it would come answers to questions that had haunted the Harrison family for nearly a decade. Whether those answers would bring peace or deeper anguish remained to be seen, but Michael knew he had no choice but to discover them. Some truths, no matter how painful, demanded to be faced. Thursday afternoon arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that made autumn in Oregon feel like a promise kept. Michael drove through streets that had become achingly familiar over 8 years of searching, past the elementary school where search volunteers had once gathered, past the creek where Tommy's sneaker had been found, toward the Hillcrest property that now represented either salvation or final heartbreak. The old homestead sat on 12 acres of overgrown pasture, its main house reduced to little more than a foundation and scattered timbers after decades of neglect. Dave Patterson was waiting beside a pickup truck loaded with demolition equipment, his weathered face showing the kind of compassion that comes from genuine understanding of loss. "Mr. Harrison," he said, extending a work-calloused hand, "I appreciate you coming out. I have to tell you, we had our surveyor take another look at this root cellar yesterday, and it's been sealed tight as a drum since before your boy went missing. Steel door, heavy padlock, the works. But I figured you needed to see for yourself." Michael nodded, his throat too tight for easy conversation. Part of him wanted to turn around, to preserve the possibility that his son might be found, rather than face another dead end. But 8 years of wondering had taught him that uncertainty was its own form of torture, worse in some ways than the most painful truth. The root cellar was located about 50 yards behind where the main house had once stood, built into a small hillside, and nearly invisible beneath decades of overgrown blackberry vines and wild grass. If not for the surveyor's equipment and freshly cut path, it would have been easy to walk past without noticing the entrance. The steel door that Patterson had mentioned was indeed formidable, thick metal, painted with rust-resistant coating that had protected it from the elements for years. "This padlock," Patterson said, pointing to the heavy brass mechanism that secured the door. "It's old, but it's solid. Doesn't look like it's been cut or tampered with. Still, I brought bolt cutters if you want to take a look inside." Michael stared at the door, his imagination filling with possibilities both hopeful and horrifying. Behind that barrier might be nothing more than shelves of forgotten preserves and root vegetables. Or it might be the answer to 8 years of prayers and nightmares, the explanation for how a 7-year-old boy could vanish without a trace from his own backyard. "Do it," he said, his voice barely audible above the whisper of wind through the tall grass. Patterson worked quickly with the bolt cutters, the brass padlock yielding with a sharp snap that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet afternoon. The steel door swung open with a groan of protest from hinges that hadn't moved in years, revealing a darkness so complete that their flashlights seemed to barely penetrate it. The first thing that struck Michael was the smell, not the musty odor of an abandoned cellar, but something fresher, almost familiar. As his eyes adjusted and Patterson's powerful work light illuminated the interior, he saw that the space was larger than expected, carved directly into the hillside with stone walls and a dirt floor that showed signs of recent disturbance. "Jesus Christ," Patterson breathed, his flashlight beam sweeping across the back wall, where someone had built what could only be described as a makeshift living space. A sleeping bag lay folded neatly on a wooden pallet, beside it a collection of canned goods, water bottles and other supplies that suggested long-term habitation. But it was the collection of items against the far wall that made Michael's knees buckle. Toys, dozens of them, arranged with the kind of care that suggested they weren't just storage but treasured possessions. Action figures, comic books, art supplies, and in the center of it all a blue tarp that matched the one Tommy had been playing with on the day he disappeared. "Call the police," Michael whispered, his flashlight beam trembling as it illuminated what appeared to be a shrine to his missing son. "Call Detective Coleman. Call everyone." Patterson was already reaching for his phone, but Michael had moved deeper into the cellar, drawn by a terrible fascination toward evidence that his son had been here, that 8 years of searching had missed this hidden sanctuary by mere miles. The sleeping bag was child-sized, the books were at a second-grade reading level, and on a makeshift shelf carved into the stone wall, he found a school notebook with Tommy Harrison written in his son's careful printing across the cover. The notebook fell open in Michael's trembling hands, revealing page after page of a 7-year-old's attempt to document his captivity. The early entries were heartbreaking in their simplicity. Day 1, I want to go home. Day 2, the man says I can't leave yet. Day 3, I miss Mom and Dad. But as the days stretched into weeks and months, the entries became more detailed, more resigned, painting a picture of a child adapting to unthinkable circumstances. "He brought me new books today," read one entry dated nearly 2 months after Tommy's disappearance. "He says if I'm good and don't try to run away, he'll get me the new superhero comic I wanted. I asked when I can go home, and he said maybe next year, if I'm really good." Michael's vision blurred as he read his son's innocent attempts to make sense of his situation, the way a child's mind tried to find logic and hope even in the darkest circumstances. Tommy had written about learning to cook simple meals on a camping stove, about the man who brought him supplies, but never stayed long enough for real conversation, about dreams of home that gradually became more distant and less frequent. The final entry was dated nearly 6 years ago, the handwriting more mature but still recognizably Tommy's. "I'm 11 now, I think. The man hasn't come back in a long time. I'm scared something happened to him. I've been eating the canned food, but it's almost gone. I tried to break the door, but it's too strong. If someone finds this, please tell my parents I never forgot them, and I tried to be brave like they taught me." Michael's legs gave out completely, and he sank to the dirt floor of the cellar, clutching his son's notebook against his chest as 8 years of hope and horror crashed over him like a tide. Tommy had been alive, had survived for years in this underground prison, had grown from a frightened 7-year-old into a young man who'd ultimately faced death alone and afraid. "Mr. Harrison?" Patterson's voice seemed to come from very far away. "The police are on their way. Maybe you should come outside now." But Michael couldn't move, couldn't process anything beyond the devastating realization that his son had been so close, had spent years waiting for rescue that never came. The careful preserve of Tommy's room, the birthday cakes for a boy who wasn't there to blow out candles, the Christmas presents that accumulated in closets, all of it had been for a child who was already beyond their reach, locked away in darkness, while life continued in the world above. The sound of sirens approaching brought Michael back to the present, but he knew that nothing would ever be the same. The 8 years of not knowing had been replaced by something worse, the knowledge that Tommy had suffered, had hoped, had waited, and had ultimately died alone while his family searched in all the wrong places. The truth they'd finally found was more terrible than any scenario they'd imagined, and yet it was also the answer they'd been praying for. Tommy's story was over, but at least now they knew how it had ended. The Hillcrest property transformed overnight into the epicenter of the most significant criminal investigation Millbrook had seen in decades. Crime scene technicians worked methodically through the root cellar, photographing and cataloging every item, while Michael sat in Detective Coleman's vehicle, staring at his son's notebook, as if it might reveal secrets beyond the devastating words already written inside. Doctor. Elizabeth Warren, the county's chief medical examiner, emerged from the cellar after what felt like hours, her expression grave as she approached the cluster of law enforcement vehicles. Michael watched through the car window as she spoke quietly with Detective Coleman, their conversation too distant to overhear, but their body language telling the story he'd been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. "Michael," Detective Coleman said as he returned to the vehicle, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone delivering news that would change everything. "We found him." The words should have brought relief, should have answered the question that had haunted 8 years of sleepless nights, but instead they felt like stones settling in Michael's chest. Tommy had been there all along, hidden beneath their feet while search parties combed the forests and dragged every body of water within 50 miles of their home. "How?" Michael asked, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted to know. Coleman settled into the driver's seat, his notebook open to pages of fresh observations and preliminary conclusions. "Dr. Warren needs to complete the full examination, but initial findings suggest malnutrition and exposure. Based on the notebook entries you found and the evidence in the cellar, it appears Tommy survived in that space for several years before." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Michael had read the final entries, had seen the empty canned goods containers, and the signs of a child trying desperately to survive after his captor had abandoned him. The timeline was clear. Tommy had died not in the first days or weeks after his disappearance, when massive search efforts might have found him, but years later, when the case had gone cold and the world had moved on. "The person responsible," Michael said, his voice hoarse. "Do you have any leads?" Detective Coleman's expression darkened. "We're looking into the property's history, previous owners, anyone who might have had access to that cellar. The lock hadn't been cut recently. Whoever put Tommy there had a key. We're also analyzing the supplies that were brought to him, trying to trace purchase records, looking for patterns. The investigation would ultimately reveal a truth more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. The man responsible was Robert Hayes, a former maintenance worker at Tommy's elementary school who had quit his job 3 weeks after the boy's disappearance. Hayes had suffered a fatal heart attack 2 years earlier, taking his secrets with him, but leaving behind a trail of evidence that investigators would painstakingly piece together over the following months. Hayes had been a loner with no family, living in a small apartment across town where investigators would later find detailed floor plans of the Harrison home, photographs taken from a distance, and a journal documenting his obsession with Tommy that stretched back months before the abduction. The root cellar had belonged to his late uncle's property, inherited years earlier and forgotten by everyone except Hayes, who had prepared it meticulously as a hiding place. The journal revealed a deeply disturbed mind that had convinced itself it was saving Tommy from some imagined danger, that keeping the boy safe and isolated was an act of love rather than kidnapping. Hayes had planned to eventually return Tommy to his family once the fictional threat had passed, but as months turned to years, his mental state had deteriorated until he could no longer face what he had done. He stopped visiting Tommy about 6 months before his own death, Detective Coleman explained to Michael and Sarah during one of their difficult briefings. Based on the evidence, it appears Hayes became increasingly paranoid and unstable. Tommy was essentially abandoned down there, left to survive on whatever supplies remained. Sarah had insisted on hearing every detail, no matter how painful. her need to understand what their son had endured, overriding her previous desire to avoid hope and disappointment. She sat rigid in the detective's office, tears streaming down her face as she absorbed the magnitude of Tommy's suffering and courage. "The notebook," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can I see it?" Michael had been carrying it with him since the discovery, unable to let go of the final connection to his son's experience. He handed it to Sarah with trembling fingers, watching as she opened to the first page and began to read Tommy's innocent words about wanting to go home. The entries painted a picture of remarkable resilience in the face of unimaginable circumstances. Tommy had created routines to maintain his sanity, had taught himself to ration food when deliveries became irregular, had even attempted to dig an escape tunnel with his bare hands until the rocky soil proved too difficult for a child to penetrate. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to an entry dated about a year after Tommy's disappearance. "He writes about missing my bedtime stories and trying to remember the endings. He was keeping pieces of us alive down there, Michael. Even in that horrible place, he held on to us." The investigation also revealed that Hayes had been monitoring the search efforts, following news coverage obsessively and adjusting his visits to the cellar to avoid detection during periods of intensive searching. He had been present at several of the vigils held for Tommy, standing in the back of crowds while maintaining the facade of a concerned community member. "The bastard was there," Michael said, his voice filled with a rage that had been building for 8 years and now had a target. "He was watching us grieve while he knew exactly where Tommy was. He could have ended it at any time." Detective Coleman nodded grimly. "The psychological profile suggests Hayes was feeding off the community's grief, that it reinforced his delusion that he was important, that he held the power to end everyone's suffering but chose not to. It's one of the most disturbing cases I've encountered in 25 years of law enforcement." The discovery brought a flood of media attention that the Harrison family was ill-equipped to handle. News trucks lined their street. Reporters knocked on their door at all hours, and the peaceful neighborhood where Tommy had once played became a circus of cameras and microphones. The story had everything that captured public imagination: an innocent child, years of mystery, and a resolution both heartbreaking and horrifying. But for Michael and Sarah, the media attention was just background noise to the more immediate challenge of processing their son's death after 8 years of hoping he might still be alive. The grief they experienced now was different from the ambiguous loss they'd carried for so long, sharper, more defined, but also strangely liberating in its finality. "At least we know," Sarah said one evening as they sat in Tommy's room, surrounded by the toys and books he'd never outgrown. "At least we know he didn't forget us, that he tried to stay strong, that he was still our Tommy, even in that terrible place." The notebook had become their most treasured possession, a window into their son's courage and spirit that no amount of grief could diminish. They read his words over and over, finding comfort in his determination to survive, in his expressions of love for them, in the evidence that even in his darkest moments he had remained the brave, loving child they remembered. Dr. Warren's final report confirmed what they had suspected. Tommy had lived in the cellar for approximately 4 years before succumbing to malnutrition and illness during a particularly harsh winter. He had been 15 years old at the time of his death, no longer the 7-year-old who had disappeared from their backyard, but a teenager who had grown up in darkness, alone and afraid. The knowledge that their son had lived so much longer than anyone had dared hope was both a blessing and a curse. It meant 4 additional years of life, of dreams and thoughts and small daily victories that no one would ever fully know, but it also meant 4 years of suffering that could have been prevented if the search had expanded in different directions, if investigators had looked beyond the obvious, if Robert Hayes had been caught before his obsession had claimed an innocent life. As the investigation concluded, and the media attention finally began to fade, Michael and Sarah found themselves facing a new challenge, learning how to grieve properly for a son they now knew was truly gone, and figuring out how to honor his memory in a way that acknowledged both his life and his courage in the face of unthinkable circumstances. The funeral that Tommy Harrison finally received 8 years after his disappearance was unlike any service Millbrook had ever witnessed. The small church overflowed with mourners who had never stopped caring, never stopped wondering, never stopped hoping that somehow the missing boy would find his way home. But now they gathered not just to grieve, but to celebrate the remarkable courage of a child who had faced the unthinkable, with a strength that humbled every adult who heard his story. Michael stood at the podium, holding his son's notebook, the worn pages containing words that had transformed their understanding of loss and resilience. His voice cracked as he read from one of Tommy's entries written during his second year in the cellar. "I pretend Mom is reading to me at bedtime, and Dad is teaching me to throw a baseball in the backyard. I can see our house in my mind, and it makes me feel less scared. I know they're looking for me, and I just have to be patient." Sarah had chosen to bury Tommy in the blue superhero pajamas he'd worn on that last morning, along with his favorite action figures and the notebook that had preserved his voice across the years of silence. The small casket, almost unbearably poignant in its size, served as a physical reminder of the childhood that had been stolen and the young man Tommy had become despite impossible circumstances. "Tommy taught us something about hope," Michael continued, his words carrying across the packed church, "not the kind of hope that denies reality, but the kind that finds light even in the deepest darkness. He never gave up believing that love was stronger than fear, that family connections could survive any distance or obstacle." The service was attended by many of the volunteers who had searched for Tommy 8 years earlier, their faces showing the complex emotions of relief mixed with sorrow. Detective Coleman sat in the front row, the case that had defined much of his career finally closed, but forever changed by what it had revealed about human cruelty and resilience in equal measure. In the weeks following the funeral, Michael and Sarah began the difficult process of learning how to live with definitive grief instead of indefinite hope. The not knowing had been its own form of torture, but it had also provided a strange kind of suspended animation that protected them from the finality of loss. Now they had to face the reality that their family would never be complete again, that Tommy's room would remain forever frozen in time, that they would grow old without witnessing their son become a man. But they also discovered unexpected sources of comfort in the truth they'd finally learned. Tommy's notebook revealed a boy who had never lost his essential character despite years of trauma. He had remained kind, hopeful and loving even in circumstances that might have broken an adult's spirit. The knowledge that he had carried their memory with him, that he had found ways to feel connected to them even in isolation, provided a kind of peace that years of uncertainty had never allowed. "He was braver than I ever could have been," Sarah said one evening as they sat together in the living room, reading through Tommy's notebook for what must have been the 100th time. 15 years old and facing death alone, but still writing about how grateful he was for the family he remembered, still hoping someone would find his words and know that he never stopped loving us. The investigation's conclusion had also brought a sense of justice. Even though Robert Hayes had escaped earthly punishment through his own death, the truth about what had happened, the knowledge that Tommy's disappearance hadn't been random or the result of their own parental failures, lifted a burden of guilt that both Michael and Sarah had carried for 8 years. Dr. Patricia Vance, the grief counselor Sarah had been seeing, helped them understand that their healing process would be different now that they knew Tommy's fate. Ambiguous loss is one of the most difficult forms of grief to process, she explained during one of their joint sessions. Your minds couldn't fully grieve because there was always the possibility that grieving would mean giving up hope. Now you can mourn properly, and that paradoxically allows for healing that wasn't possible before. Michael found himself returning to the woods where he'd spent countless hours searching, but now his walks were contemplative rather than frantic. He would sit by Miller's Creek where Tommy's sneaker had been found and feel a strange kind of peace, knowing that his son's story was finally complete. The searching was over, the wandering had ended, and in their place was the hard but necessary work of building a life around memory rather than possibility. They established the Tommy Harrison Foundation, dedicated to improving search protocols for missing children and supporting families trapped in the limbo of not knowing. Michael's obsessive research into Tommy's case had made him an expert on the gaps in standard search procedures, and he channeled that knowledge into advocacy for more comprehensive investigation techniques. If we'd searched abandoned buildings more systematically, he told a congressional committee studying missing children protocols, if we'd looked beyond the obvious places where a lost child might wander, Tommy might have been found in time. Our pain can't be undone, but maybe we can prevent other families from enduring what we've been through. Sarah returned to teaching full-time, finding purpose in nurturing other people's children and sharing subtle lessons about resilience and courage that she'd learned from her son's notebook. She never spoke directly about Tommy in her classroom, but his influence was present in the way she encouraged her students to face challenges, to maintain hope in difficult circumstances, to understand that love could transcend any distance or obstacle. The house began to feel like a home again rather than a shrine. Tommy's room remained unchanged, but the rest of the space gradually filled with new memories, new conversations, new moments of happiness that didn't feel like betrayals of their son's memory. They learned to celebrate his birthday as a day of remembrance rather than mourning, sharing stories about the boy he had been and marveling at the young man he had become, despite circumstances that should have crushed his spirit. 8 years of uncertainty had been replaced by the complex but manageable challenge of living with loss. They would never stop missing Tommy, would never stop wondering what kind of man he might have become if given the chance to grow up in sunlight rather than darkness. But they had his words, his demonstration of courage, his proof that love could survive even the most terrible circumstances. The healing wasn't complete. Perhaps it never would be, but it was real and growing stronger each day. They had found their son at last, not in the way they had hoped, but in the way that allowed them to finally say goodbye and begin the long journey toward peace. 5 years had passed since the discovery in the root cellar, and Michael Harrison found himself standing once again at his living room window, watching the street where Tommy had once played. But this time, the view brought something close to contentment, rather than the aching emptiness that had defined so many years. The maple tree in their front yard showed the first hints of autumn color, and children's voices carried on the crisp air as a new generation of families made their homes in the neighborhood. The Tommy Harrison Foundation had grown beyond anything Michael and Sarah had initially imagined. What began as their private mission to prevent other families from enduring their particular form of hell had evolved into a nationally recognized organization that had already helped locate 17 missing children. The systematic search protocols they'd developed, which emphasized abandoned structures and forgotten spaces, had become standard practice in law enforcement agencies across the country. "Dad?" The voice came from behind him, young and hesitant. Michael turned to see Katie Reynolds, the 8-year-old daughter of their next-door neighbors, holding a small wrapped package. Her family had moved in 2 years earlier, and Katie had become something of a surrogate grandchild to Michael and Sarah, filling their home with the kind of laughter that had been absent for too long. "What do you have there, sweetheart?" Michael asked, kneeling down to Katie's eye level. "Mum helped me make something for Tommy," she said, her voice serious in the way children become when they understand they're dealing with important matters. "She told me about your son and how brave he was. I wanted to make him something." Inside the wrapping paper was a small ceramic angel, painted in bright colors with a superhero cape attached with careful stitches. It was the kind of craft project that only a child would conceive, combining sacred and secular elements in a way that captured the essence of innocence better than any professional artwork. "It's beautiful, Katie," Michael said, his voice thick with emotion. "Would you like to come with me to put it in Tommy's room?" They climbed the stairs together, Katie's small hand in Michael's weathered one, and entered the space that had remained exactly as Tommy had left it 13 years earlier. But now the room felt less like a shrine and more like a celebration, filled with mementos from the many children who had been found because of the Foundation's work, letters from grateful families, and artwork from kids like Katie, who understood that remembering someone meant keeping their spirit alive. Katie placed her angel on Tommy's dresser, next to his collection of action figures, and stood quietly for a moment, as if she were in church. "Do you think he would have liked it?" she asked. "I think he would have loved it," Michael replied, and he meant it. The boy revealed in the notebook entries the child who had found reasons for gratitude, even in the darkest circumstances, would have treasured Katie's gift and the love behind it. Sarah's voice called up from downstairs, announcing that dinner was ready. She had been cooking for the volunteers who were helping prepare for the Foundation's annual fundraising dinner, and the house smelled like the warm, lived-in home it had been before tragedy changed everything. "Will you tell me a story about Tommy sometime?" Katie asked as they headed back downstairs. "I'd love to," Michael said, realizing that the stories he could tell now were no longer painful. They were precious. Tommy's courage, his determination to survive, his love for his family that never wavered, these weren't sources of grief anymore, but wellsprings of inspiration. The evening brought a gathering of people whose lives had been touched by Tommy's story. Detective Coleman, now retired but still involved with the Foundation, shared updates on cases where their protocols had made the difference between tragedy and reunion. Dr. Vance spoke about the healing power of turning personal pain into public service. Dave Patterson, the construction foreman who had found the root cellar, brought his teenage daughter, who was now studying criminal justice, partly because of Tommy's story. "I was thinking," Sarah said as the evening wound down and the last volunteers were leaving, "maybe it's time to update Tommy's room. Not completely, but add some new things. Pictures of the kids we've helped find, letters from families we've supported. Make it less about what we lost and more about what his life has meant." Michael nodded, understanding perfectly. The room had served its purpose as a preserved memorial, but Tommy's true legacy lived in the children who were home with their families, instead of lost in darkness, in the families who had been spared the years of uncertainty that had defined the Harrisons' existence. Later that night, as they prepared for bed, Michael found himself reading once more from Tommy's notebook, not with the desperate hunger for connection that had characterized the early years, but with the kind of peaceful remembrance that honored both the boy who had written those words and the man he might have become. "Day 847, he read aloud to Sarah. "I dreamed about home again last night. In the dream I was older, maybe Dad's age, and I had kids of my own. I was telling them about my parents and how much they loved me, how they never gave up looking for me even when I was lost. I think that's what I want most, for people to know that love doesn't stop, even when everything else does." Sarah squeezed his hand as he closed the notebook. "He knew," she said softly. Somehow he knew that his story would help others, that his courage would matter beyond just surviving those years in the cellar. Michael looked out their bedroom window at the street where Tommy had played, where other children played now, where the cycle of family life continued with all its joys and sorrows and small daily miracles. The ache of loss would never completely disappear, but it had been joined by something stronger, the knowledge that love truly didn't stop, that a father's hope could survive even the worst imaginable outcome, and that sometimes the most terrible endings could become the beginning of healing for others. Tommy was at peace, and finally so were they. The foundation would continue its work, searching for children who were still lost, supporting families who were still hoping, carrying forward the lesson that Tommy had written in a child's handwriting in a dark cellar. That love transcends distance, that hope can survive even in the deepest darkness, and that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is simply refuse to give up. Outside, the streetlights flickered on, illuminating the neighborhood where Tommy Harrison had once built forts and dreamed of adventures. New children would play on these sidewalks, new families would make memories in these houses, and the cycle of life would continue, enriched by the knowledge that even in the face of unthinkable loss, the human capacity for love and courage could transform tragedy into purpose. Michael Harrison had spent 13 years searching for his son. In the end, he had found not just Tommy, but a peace that transcended grief, and a purpose that honored both the boy who had been lost and the children who could still be saved. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end. If you enjoyed this story and appreciate this kind of content, please subscribe to the channel so you won't miss upcoming videos and more fascinating stories. Until next time.